You've heard the phrase, the cradle of civilization. But do you know what that actually means? It means Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Here, over 5,000 years ago, humanity made its first giant leap toward everything we call civilization today. And soon you'll know exactly why. We'll cover kings, gods, and the very first written words. And at the end, I'll share a truly bizarre, even profane practice from ancient Mesopotamia that I could not leave out of this video, and trust me, it's one of the strangest and most disturbing things I've come across. Mesopotamia's history begins in Sumer, around 3500 BCE, in what is today southern Iraq near the Persian Gulf. Small farming villages along the fertile riverbanks turned into the world's first true cities, Uruk, Ur, and Eridu. Historian Samuel Noah Kramer, in History Begins at Sumer, reminds us that nearly every invention of civilization started here. Writing, the wheel, schools, even the concept of government itself. Let's get to the facts now, and talk about one of the things that truly made Mesopotamia remarkable. It was around 3200 BCE when scribes invented cuneiform writing, wedge marks pressed into clay tablets. What's fascinating is that they didn't start with stories or poems. They started with receipts. As Irving Finkel explains in Cuneiform, writing began as bookkeeping, lists of sheep, jars of beer, grain owed to temples. Only later did it evolve into myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving story. And Gilgamesh isn't just a story, it features a flood narrative that sounds eerily like Noah's Ark, written 1,000 years earlier. The Sumerian gods were unpredictable and even cruel. You can feel that in their myths. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality ends in failure. The gods toy with human lives. And even the Great Flood is sent not out of love or justice, but because humans were noisy and annoyed the gods. Their stories weren't about hope. They were about surviving in a world ruled by powers you could never fully trust. I want to take a moment to talk to you. There is something that always puzzled me. And while I am a religious person with my personal beliefs, you may have yours, and I respect that. But here's my question. Every civilization I study, and from ancient to modern, always has this deep desire to worship something greater than ourselves, almost as if it's imprinted in our DNA. Why is religion and gods so prevalent in every single civilization out there? Do you think it is simply because they attributed to the gods something they could not explain? I'd love to know your opinion in the comments. Thanks! Back to your video now. Sumer flourished for centuries, but city-states were constantly at war with one another. That chaos opened the door for a new power, the Akkadians. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian cities and built what historians consider the world's first empire. He spread Sumerian culture far and wide, but in Akkadian, the language of his people. I see this almost as if the Sumerians were robbed of their own culture. This first empire had it coming their way. Maybe the wrath of the gods? Either way, after only about 150 years, droughts, invasions by mountain tribes, and internal rebellions shattered Akkad. Sumerian cities regained independence for a while, but they had been severely weakened. And as they say, when the walls are cracked, the enemy walks in. In that weakness stepped a rising power to the south. And I know you've heard of them before, Babylon. Babylon's most famous ruler was Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE. His code, carved into stone, is often seen as the first legal system. But read it closely, and it's brutal. As Mark van de Meerup notes in King Hammurabi of Babylon, punishments weren't about fairness. They were about order and fear. An eye for an eye wasn't metaphorical, it was policy. Still, Hammurabi's code wasn't only about punishments. It also protected widows, orphans, and debtors. It wasn't modern justice, but it was the first attempt to bind a society together through written law. Babylon thrived, but history repeats itself. Eventually, it too fell to outside powers, including the Hittites and Kassites. For centuries, Mesopotamia became a patchwork of competing states. Out of this turbulence rose the Assyrians. The Assyrians had been a kingdom for well over 1,000 years, but by 900 BCE, they transformed into a ruthless military machine. For nearly 300 years, they dominated the Near East. Assyrian kings didn't just conquer. They wanted obedience through fear, and that worked for them. Ashurnasirpal II, one of their kings, left inscriptions boasting of flaying rebels alive and hanging their skins on city walls. Historian Karen Radner in Ancient Assyria explains that these were not exaggerations. They were deliberate propaganda meant to terrify enemies into surrender before the first arrow was even fired. But as we know, empires rise and fall. Around 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes stormed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and brought their brutal empire to an end. With Assyria gone, Babylon rose again, this time under Nebuchadnezzar II, and you may have heard that name from the Bible. He rebuilt the city into one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Ishtar Gate, covered in bright blue glazed bricks and golden lions, symbolized Babylon's power. According to later tradition, Nebuchadnezzar also built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though historians still debate whether they truly existed. Babylon's second golden age was brilliant, but short. By 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia swept in and absorbed Mesopotamia into the Persian Empire. After thousands of years of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, the land between the rivers was no longer the center of power, but its legacy would never fade. Now, remember that bizarre fact I promised? Here it is. According to Herodotus and later accounts, in some Mesopotamian cities there was a custom known as sacred prostitution. Women, at least once in their lives, were required to visit the temple of Ishtar and sleep with a stranger as an offering to the goddess. In return, they received a small coin, the payment symbolizing the goddess's blessing. Modern scholars debate how widespread this was, but if true, it's one of the strangest and most unsettling rituals in human history. So what's the legacy of Mesopotamia? Paul Krawczyk puts it in Babylon, Mesopotamia and the birth of civilization. It wasn't just the inventions, it was the framework of civilization itself. Laws, writing, cities, empires, all of it starts here, in the land between the rivers. And maybe that's the real lesson. Mesopotamia shows us how fragile and yet how powerful the idea of civilization can be. From clay tablets to brutal kings, from myths of floods to laws carved in stone. It was here that humanity first began to shape its destiny, and our society is a reflection of that. In our next episode, I will dive into another legendary civilization, ancient Greece, and we'll start with one of its fiercest, most fascinating powers, Sparta.